Hello, and welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Rihanna. As I was going through this, I'm always very aware of the difference between the Bantu education system and everything else that comes. And I'm going to compare what they look like, what I experience. What did that typical day look like before that first lesson happened in these rural communities? So these children often walked kilometers to reach school. And that still happens today. Shoes were a luxury. Some walked barefoot over rough ground in cold winter or summer heat. Urban township students faced overcrowded buses or long commutes on foot through neighborhood marked by poverty and police surveillance. So these children were always in a state of awareness and something could go wrong at any minute. Breakfast was not guaranteed. Hunger accompanied students into the classroom. A former pupil recalled, "You could not concentrate because your stomach was louder than the teacher. I literally feel that in my soul at the moment fasting." Class sizes commonly exceeded 60 learners. In extreme cases, more than 80 students shared a single teacher. Desks were scarce. Some sat on benches, others on the floor. Textbooks were often shared. One book for several students. Chalkboards were worn thin from repeated use. Science equipment, maps, and libraries were rare luxuries. Teachers did what they could with minimal tools, relying heavily on rote learning and repetition. Lessons emphasize basic literacy, numeracy, and practical skills. Creative or critical thinking was not encouraged. Subjects were framed to reinforce social roles. Boys were prepared for manual labor, girls for domestic work, agricultural training for rural futures, and limited exposure to higher academic pathways. History lessons foregrounded European achievements while marginalizing African civilizations and contemporary struggles. Schools emphasized obedience. Corporal punishment was widely used and legally sanctioned. Discipline reinforced not only classroom order but acceptance of hierarchy, a reflection of the broader society. Uniforms were required, symbolized order, but also exposed inequality. Some students wore worn or mismatched clothing, highlighting their economic hardship. I spoke about this difficult position that teachers were in. Some, quietly resisted by teaching. One teacher reflected, "We taught two syllabi, the official one and the one we carried in our heart." Teachers were respected figures, but also vulnerable to state scrutiny. So despite hardship, schools were also spaces of friendship, play, and emerging identity. As they are. Sports, music, and informal discussions created bonds that would later underpin political mobilization. Peer networks formed across neighborhoods, facilitating the spread of ideas and information. Then, for many of these kids, education did not end the day's labor. Many children returned home to chores. I'm not talking about washing the dishes. I'm talking about fetching water or firewood, caring for your younger siblings, working in fields or informal jobs, studying by dim light if electricity was available. Homework competed with survival. Despite structural limitations, many students excelled through extraordinary effort. Education remained a symbol of possibility, even when the system constrained the outcomes. The contradiction between aspiration and opportunity would eventually feel resistance. Even though they centralized the education system by taking everything in, they still separated them out. So they didn't build one education system. They just centralized it from a control perspective, but they didn't build one system. They ended up building four, each designed not simply to teach, but to reproduce a social order. It's very, very important. As it was separating people spatially, it was also separating them from education and opportunities. This carefully calibrated hierarchy in which race determines opportunity, mobility, and power. While Bantu education shaped the lives of African children, parallel systems existed for those classified as white, Indian, and colored. They differed in resources, curriculum, governance, and expectation, but they shared a common purpose: to maintain apartheid without appearing uniformly oppressive. From the white education perspective, they were preparing rulers. White schools were administered by the Department of National Education and provincial authorities. They received the lion's share of funding and political attention. Education for white children was framed as an investment in the nation's future, meaning the future of white South Africa. Facilities rivaled that of developed countries. They had modern classrooms and laboratories, extensive libraries, qualified teachers, small class sizes, broad subject offerings, and strong extracurricular programs. Students could pursue academic, technical, or vocational pathways leading to university and professional careers. White education normalized apartheid as social order. History emphasized European settlement and Afrikaner nationalism. Civic instruction framed white government as legitimate and necessary. Many white students grew up insulated from the realities of other systems, encountering apartheid as abstraction rather than daily experience. A former student later reflected, "We were taught to live in a normal country." When I went into the workplace, I experienced this insulation by the questions I used to get from my colleagues, whether they were white or black or Indian. There wasn't a shared understanding amongst us. I feel like I do feel like there was more understanding between the non-white colleagues than there was from the white colleagues. So there was a lot of miscommunication, misunderstanding, stereotypes that existed that then informed the way questions were asked. When I started working, it was 2005. No, it was 2001. And by the time I got into bigger companies, that was probably around 2005. To see people seek information about your people because they've never experienced, never had those realities because they were never exposed to it, even in 2005, was really eye-opening for me. And then existed for many years after that. It's very interesting. I call it isolation because when we needed to integrate with each other, there was less of an understanding from their perspective. And a lot of the time it was like, well, we didn't know. Like the student says, we were taught to live in a normal country. Then we had Indian education, which was controlled aspiration. So the education of South Africans classified as Indian fell under the Department of Indian Affairs. Look, it says what it is on the tin. It's not like they're hiding it. No, they didn't call it the white education thing. They call it national education. Okay, here's where the difference comes, right? There's not telling you that it's for whites only, but here it starts telling you that it's for Indians only. Bantu education, colored education. Says it on the name. This system reflected the regime's ambivalence towards Indian communities, economically valuable but politically marginalized. Indian schools often achieved relatively high academic standards despite limited funding compared to white institutions. Many students pursued careers in medicine, law, commerce, and teaching, particularly within segregated communities. However, these remain constrained to certain limited access to certain universities, employment barriers, residential segregation, and political exclusion. Education prepared students for professional roles without granting full citizenship. Indian communities placed strong emphasis on education as a pathway to stability and achievements. Parents invested heavily despite structural limitations. At the same time, student activism was significant, with many participating in anti-apartheid movements. We had the colored education, the intermediary strategy. Colored education was overseen by the Department of Colored Affairs. Oh my God, I'm so surprised. The regime sought to cultivate a loyal intermediary group, educated enough to support the economy, but excluded from political power. Facilities generally exceeded those of African schools, but lagged far behind white institutions. Schools offer broader academic subjects, including pathways to technical and clerical work. Systemic inequality persisted. Overcrowded conditions in growing townships, limited funding, and restricted higher education access. We spoke about Bantu schools being about between 60 and 80. In our classrooms, it was between 30 and 40. Or 25 and 40, so that was the size of the classrooms. So yeah, they were quite full. Viewed together, the system formed a deliberate pyramid. White, leadership, governance, professional dominance. Indian, professional roles within the segregated society. Colored, clerical and intermediary functions. African, manual labor and rural subsistence. Funding, infrastructure, teacher training, and curriculum aligned with these expectations. Education did not merely reflect inequality, it manufactured it. Despite legal separations, the systems were not completely isolated. Urban proximity meant students could sometimes see schools allotted to other racial groups, their modern buildings contrasted with their dilapidated facilities. These visual comparisons reinforce awareness of injustice, particularly among non-white students. For white students, separation often prevented direct exposure to disparities, sustaining the illusion of normality. So when they say they didn't know, it's saying that education became a major arena of resistance across all oppressed communities. Indian and colored students organized boycotts, demonstrations, and alliances with African student movements. Teacher unions and civic organization challenged discriminatory policies. Each community experienced distinct consequence as a result of these systems. For the white communities, education privilege translated into economic dominance, professional networks, and political influence that extended into the democratic era. For Indian communities, higher education facilitated professional advancement, though spatial segregation and economic barriers persisted. For the colored community, intermediate opportunities created a complex position, neither privileged nor entirely excluded, often accompanied by internal debates about identity and political alignment. Really did. Really did. So, in 1994, the legal segregation ended, but education inequality remained deeply embedded. How do you turn around a system and 40 years in place? Your former white schools retained infrastructure, funding models, and social capital. Your township schools across all non-white communities face the compounded effects of decades of underinvestment. Efforts to equalize funding and access have achieved significant gains, but continue to confront structural disparities rooted in history. Apartheid planners believed that by shaping education, they could shape the future. In many ways they did, but not entirely as intended. While the systems reproduced inequality, they also produced educated critics, organizers, and leaders who ultimately dismantled the regime. Separate education didn't more than divide classrooms, it divided perceptions, which it really did, opportunities, and life trajectories. Yet across those divisions, students increasingly recognize a shared reality. Inequality was not accidental, it was designed. 1994, South Africa did not begin anew. Democracy arrived carrying the weight of history, including an education system designed for inequality. Segregation laws disappeared overnight. Infrastructure disparity did not. Former white schools stood with laboratories, breweries, fields, and established traditions. Many township schools stood with overcrowded classrooms, buildings, and generation of accumulated disadvantage. The new government faced a monumental task: education from an instrument of apartheid into a foundation for equality without the luxury of starting from scratch. So I remember when I was at school and 94 happened and schools opened up to everyone. We had quite a lot of students coming from Black communities that joined us at school, and that was our integration, if I must put it that way. But I remember my parents sitting us down and going, okay, so you can transfer schools and you can go to a Model C school, which was, Model C schools, just call it white schools. Okay. Previously Model C schools, or you could stay where you were. And they always gave us the opportunity to contribute to the conversation, which I appreciate. There might have been an opportunity for us to make a different decision at that stage, but both my sister and I decided to stay at the school we were. The unintended consequence for myself and her was that when I got to Technikon, I didn't really know much about computers. We did not have at school. Whereas my counterpart starting in our first year studying computers had computers since they were 12, 13. They had been coding since then. It was literally myself and my friend who started this together, literally starting from scratch. We did not know anything. So while at a disadvantage, because it really did set us back in certain ways. It took us longer to get to the point that we got to, but we got there in the end. But I always look at that moment of making that decision. Because my parents were always very clear about our economic situation, we made our decisions based on who we were, where we were, and the impact on the family unit. My parents were so transparent about those things. Oh, decisions were never really selfishly made. Always made with the unit thinking. And the one thing I knew was that whatever I chose, whatever I did, my parents would always have my back and that we would go through it together as a unit. And therefore, when both of us walked away from our educations, me 4 years later, my sister, well, as is accumulated, there was breaks in between. Before she did a master's in psychology, we did walk away without any financial debt. And that I'm forever grateful. Sorry about the side story, but I just wanted to add that, that when it became available, we didn't just jump at it. Yeah. It was just a decision that we made based on the unit. Reform was administrative. 17 racially based education departments, 17 were merged into a single national system with provincial administrations. Curricula were rewritten to remove racist content and promote democratic values, human rights, and African history. New policies emphasize non-racial access, compulsory schooling, gender equality, and inclusive education. A senior policymaker later described the challenge: we had to build a new house while people were still living inside the old one. That is so much what happened. So because we were at a certain point in our education, you had to think about introducing certain things at that point that the person had not heard about or had interactions with pre that, right? What were you going to do? Were you going to start at grade 1? Were you going to start introducing maybe at high school? So where's your breaking point to start the re-education and the democratic education of your school-going population? It's so tricky. Post-apartheid reform dramatically increased access to schooling. Policies introduced non-fee schools for poor communities, school nutrition programs, transport support in some areas, and expanded early education, childhood education. Enrollment rates rose sharply, particularly among African children who had previously faced barriers to continuation beyond primary school. Understand that not every person in the Bantu education system had the opportunity to go past primary school education. Millions gained access to education that earlier generations had been denied. Education was reimagined as a tool for nation building. Curricula shifted towards critical thinking, democratic citizenship, and skills for modern economy. Outcome-based education was introduced in the late 90s, aiming to move away from rote learning towards student-centered approaches. The transition proved difficult. I absolutely remember this. People that you knew as teachers had problems with it. Parents who had children in school were like, what is my child learning? So it had its problems. Teachers trained under earlier systems struggled with this new methodology. Resources were uneven. Administrative burdens increased. Outcomes-based education was later revised and partially replaced, illustrating the complexity of systemic transformation. Former white public schools, often called Model C schools, became symbols of both progress and persistent inequality. Legally open to all races, many attracted diverse student bodies, but they retained advantages: strong infrastructure, experienced teachers, active parent funding, alumni networks, and extracurricular opportunities. Now, you have to remember to uplift an Indian, colored, or Bantu school where parents were pigeonholed into certain careers and certain opportunities. And we're talking about mass here. Okay, we're not talking about these 5 people can contribute and help this one school. Inactive parent funding for white schools was a mass capability and ability that did not exist in those other education systems. It's very important. So when you go forward and you still have that funding coming in, but you're colored or Indian, Bantu education does not have that available to it, because for 40 years wasn't possible. School governing bodies were allowed to charge fees in these Model C schools, enabling continued resource accumulation. For families who could afford transport and fees, these schools offered pathways to upward mobility. For poorer families, access remained limited. Many schools in historically disadvantaged areas face profound challenges: overcrowded classrooms, teacher shortages, insufficient learning materials, poor infrastructure, and safety concerns. In some rural areas, pit latrines remained in use decades after apartheid, a stark reminder of uneven development. Socioeconomic conditions compounded education difficulties: poverty, food insecurity, crime, limited parental literacy, long travel distances. Education alone could not overcome these structural obstacles. Teachers were central to reform and among those most affected by it. Many had been trained under apartheid systems and now had to adapt to the new curricula, technologies, and expectations. Professional development programs attempted to bridge the gaps, but uneven implementation produced disparities in teaching quality. Teachers' unions became powerful actors, advocating for working conditions while sometimes clashing with governments over accountability. Universities opened to all races, transforming campuses once reserved for whites. Financial aid programs expanded access for disadvantaged students. Its rising tuition fees costs created new barriers. I remember for myself when I was in standard 8, what is it, grade 10? Yes. It's grade 10. I got accepted into a Saturday program at the Vista University in Port Elizabeth. So what they were doing was they were preparing previously disadvantaged students for going into universities. Because the opportunity hadn't been there in full, when students were leaving high school and going into these previously white only campuses, they were overwhelmed. They didn't really understand how to navigate it. And what this program did was, from standard 8 to matric, I went every Saturday, and there was a lecture that you went into a lecture hall room. You were experiencing university life so that you wouldn't be so overwhelmed that you dropped out. So they tried to create that barrier for kids from previously disadvantaged areas, which I found just absolutely amazing. That was actually where I had a conversation with the lecturer who was white at that university, and she recommended what I do for higher education, and it really did set me up in my life, and I wish I remembered her name. But anyway, yeah, so I understand that it was really hard for my parents at some stage when we were both at university. The first payment for the university, well, Technicon was lower, but university was quite a lot. And then there was one year we were both, and it was just so much. It really took some sacrifices from my parents and us as a unit to make that possible. I mean, always in awe of how my parents pulled these things off. So thank you. And now you see students still suffering from the ability to get into, or really either get financial aid, or their parents are unable to help them with their tuition. So now you have this fees must fall protest that we see happening, which really highlights the ongoing struggle for affordable higher education, linking the current grievances to the historical injustice. So it really has just persisted to the point that people are struggling to get the opportunities to learn. So language policy still remains contentious. South Africa has 11 official languages, but English increasingly became the dominant medium of instruction, especially in higher education. While this facilitated global integration, it also raised concern about the marginalization of indigenous languages and cultural identity. I spoke about it earlier about if your facilitation and education is in a certain language up to a point, and then you go to university and it's completely in English, your ability to adjust becomes just so much harder. It just becomes another barrier for you to be successful in those spaces. And apart from, us looking at the education impact and the accessibility of higher education, whether it's through language or through fees, we have a high youth unemployment rate, which means that even graduates struggle to find work. So we're saying schooling will promise advancement, but the labor market doesn't always deliver. And if you're on the labor market, you understand the challenges that you face. Post 1994 education achieved significant successes. We had a near universal primary school enrollment. We expanded secondary completion rates, increased female participation, growth in higher education access, emergence of multiracial professional class. So many individuals from historically disadvantaged backgrounds have achieved extraordinary success through education. Agreed. But it still poses the problem of masses. right? We say out of a population of 200,000 or higher education individuals, 10% is successful. What happens to the rest? And if you apply that to the bigger population, then the numbers just shrink. South Africa's education system today reflects both legacy and liberation. It has shed legal segregation but retains structural inequality shaped by geography, wealth, and history. Reform is ongoing, not a single event, but a continuous process. From apartheid classroom to democratic schools, the story of South African education reveals enduring truths. And I've said this before, systems can change faster than structures. So policy reform does not instantaneously erase inequality. Education both reflects and shapes society. Schools cannot be isolated from the broader economic realities. Access is not the same as equity. Being allowed into a classroom does not guarantee equal opportunity. History persists. The past continues to influence present outcomes. Education once served as a tool of division. Today is one of the country's most important arenas for building unity, opportunity, and dignity. The struggle over schooling did not end with apartheid. It simply entered a new chapter, and it's ongoing. One in which the question is no longer who may learn, but whether learning can truly transform lives in a society still healing from its past. Thank you so much for listening. I really wanted to look at even post apartheid education and the impacts, long-term impacts. But the really big and important thing that I wanted to get across here was how disadvantaged the Bantu education department, or how disadvantaged the students were that were in the Bantu education system, and how through seeing what everybody else had and seeing what their urban counterparts had, it really started fostering this resistance, and this resistance led to 1976. But the system, what was there before, what came after, the real oppression through education really sparked 1976, but also has a long-term impact on our country and where we are today. And that's really important to understand when we're looking at our communities, whether individually or connected. Next week, I'm going to introduce you to two individuals, and then we'll go into that period running up to Soweto, 1976. So join me as you go through where my brain went on this journey as I was putting all this together and researching it. Thank you and bye.